Grief makes people uncomfortable when it lasts too long. That was what my daughter-in-law told me, while I stood beside my son's grave holding a bouquet of white carnations that cost $14.99 from the grocery store on Maple Avenue. I remember the exact price because after you lose a child, your mind starts holding on to strange little details just to survive. The wind that morning was cold enough to sting my cheeks, even though it was already late April in Ohio. I had worn Daniel's old navy blue sweatshirt under my coat because it still carried the faint scent of cedar and laundry detergent if I pressed my face close enough to the fabric. I was kneeling beside the headstone, brushing dead leaves away from his name with my gloved hand, when I heard Melissa's heels clicking against the cemetery pavement behind me. Slow, sharp, impatient. "Evelyn," she said with a sigh, like I had become another chore she needed to deal with before lunch. "We need to talk about this." I looked up at her. She wore oversized sunglasses even though the sky was gray. Her blonde hair was perfectly curled, not a strand out of place. Behind her sat a brand new white SUV with the engine still running. She didn't even bother turning it off. "About what?" I asked quietly. She crossed her arms and glanced around the cemetery before lowering her voice. "People are starting to notice how often you come here." At first, I honestly thought she meant the groundskeeper. Maybe I'd parked in the wrong section again. Maybe flowers weren't allowed near the base of the stone anymore. But then she said something I will hear in my head for the rest of my life. "The grieving is becoming embarrassing for the family." I felt the air leave my lungs so suddenly I had to steady myself against the marble headstone. For a moment I could only stare at her. My son had been dead for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. I knew because I counted every single one of them. Embarrassing, I repeated. She let out another tired sigh. "Evelyn, the kids are moving on." "I'm moving on. Everyone is trying to heal. But every Sunday you come here crying like it just happened yesterday." I looked down at Daniel's name carved into the stone. Daniel Parker. Beloved father. Beloved son. Age 41. The grass around the grave had started growing again after winter, thin patches of green pushing through the cold earth. I swallowed hard before speaking. "It did happen yesterday," I whispered. "At least for me." Melissa stared at me for another few seconds after I said that, like she was trying to decide whether I was being dramatic or simply difficult. Then she adjusted the sleeve of her cream-colored coat and shook her head softly. "You cannot keep living like this, Evelyn," she said. "It is not healthy." I almost laughed at the word healthy. There is nothing healthy about lowering your 20-pound grandson into your lap because he is crying for his father at 2 in the morning. There is nothing healthy about standing in the cereal aisle staring at your dead son's favorite brand because your hands suddenly stop working. But I knew better than to say any of that out loud. Melissa did not want honesty. She wanted convenience. "I come here once a week," I said carefully. "I sit quietly. I bring flowers. I talk to my son." "You sob beside a grave where other families can see you," she replied. "Last week, one of the mothers from Lily's school recognized you. Lily was humiliated." That word again. Humiliated. As if grief were some kind of bad table manners. I looked past her toward the rows of headstones stretching across the cemetery hill. Some graves had fresh flowers. Some had tiny American flags. Some looked forgotten entirely. But every single stone represented somebody who had once been loved so deeply that another person could not bear their absence. "Daniel was my child," I whispered. "And he was my husband," Melissa answered immediately. Her voice sharpened for the first time that morning. "But I still get up every day and function." I nodded slowly because there was no point arguing with people who thought survival and healing were the same thing. The truth was, I had once admired Melissa for exactly that quality. Before Daniel died, she was organized, polished, efficient. She color-coded school calendars and packed snacks in reusable containers, and somehow managed to make ordinary suburban life look effortless. But after the funeral, something inside her changed. Or maybe it had always been there, hidden beneath all those perfect holiday cards and spotless kitchen counters. I noticed it first 6 months after Daniel passed away when she removed every photograph of him from the living room. When I asked why, she smiled tightly and said the children needed less sadness in the house. Then came the smaller disappearances. His winter boots. His fishing rods. his coffee mug from the fire station. One by one, pieces of my son vanished from that house like he had never existed there at all. I still remember opening the hallway closet one Thanksgiving and finding empty hangers where Daniel's jackets used to be. I stood there touching the bare metal rod while laughter drifted in from the dining room. Nobody noticed I had disappeared for nearly 20 minutes. After Melissa drove away from the cemetery, I stayed there another hour even though my knees hurt from kneeling on damp ground. I traced Daniel's name with my fingertips the way I used to smooth his hair back when he was little and sick with the flu. Some habits never leave a mother. On the drive home, I passed the fire station where he had worked for nearly 15 years. The flag outside moved lazily in the wind, and for one foolish second, my heart reacted before my brain did. I almost expected him to walk out wearing that heavy navy uniform with his sleeves rolled up and a paper cup of coffee balanced in his hand. Grief does strange things to time. Sometimes 3 years feels like 3 minutes. Other times it feels like you have been abandoned for an entire lifetime. That evening, Melissa hosted one of her backyard family dinners. She still held them every other Sunday like clockwork. Matching patio plates, folded cloth napkins, lemon slices floating in glasses of iced tea. Everything looked beautiful from a distance, which was exactly how Melissa preferred things. I arrived carrying a peach cobbler I had baked that afternoon because Daniel used to love it. He always added too much vanilla ice cream on top and claimed cold desserts tasted better in oversized bowls. I had barely stepped through the back gate when my granddaughter Lily ran toward me. She was 9 now, tall and thin like her father. "Grandma Evelyn," she shouted, wrapping her arms around my waist. For a moment, the heaviness inside my chest softened. Then Melissa's voice floated across the patio. "Lily, sweetheart, do not squeeze too hard. Grandma is emotional today." Several people looked up from their lawn chairs. I noticed Melissa smiling politely while arranging hamburger buns onto a wooden tray. The humiliation was subtle enough that anyone else might have missed it. But I did not. I sat quietly near the edge of the patio while conversations moved around me like water around a stone. At one point Melissa's neighbor asked if I had enjoyed the sunny weather lately, and before I could answer, Melissa laughed lightly and said, "Evelyn spends most Sundays at the cemetery, actually." A strange silence followed. Not dramatic, not loud, just uncomfortable enough to make everyone suddenly interested in their drinks. I felt heat crawl into my face. "I visit Daniel," I said softly. Melissa gave a tiny shrug. "I just worry the children are becoming too exposed to sadness. Lily asked me last week if grieving ever ends." She said it casually while setting down a bowl of potato salad, but every word landed like a bruise. Then my youngest grandson Ethan looked up from the picnic table and asked the question nobody else had the courage to say out loud. "Why are we not supposed to talk about Dad anymore?" The entire backyard went quiet after Ethan asked that question. Even the little string lights hanging across the fence seemed too bright all of a sudden. Melissa froze beside the patio table with a serving spoon still in her hand. Lily looked down at her plate. A few relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances before pretending to focus on their food again. That was the thing about families. Most people would rather protect comfort than truth. Melissa recovered first. She forced a small laugh and brushed invisible crumbs from her cardigan. "Nobody said that, sweetheart," she told Ethan gently. "We just do not need to be sad all the time." Ethan frowned. He had Daniel's eyes. The exact same. Blue-gray color that always looked thoughtful even when he was little. "But Grandma talks about Dad," he said quietly. "I like when she does." Melissa's smile tightened so quickly most people probably missed it. But I saw it. "Mothers notice everything." "Eat your dinner," she replied. Then she changed the subject so fast it almost gave me whiplash. "Who wants more lemonade?" The conversation slowly restarted after that, but something had shifted. I could feel it sitting there beneath every polite laugh and clinking glass, like a crack spreading under fresh paint. Later that evening, while everyone gathered around the fire pit roasting marshmallows, I slipped quietly inside the house to wash the empty cobbler dish. The kitchen looked different again. Cleaner. Colder. The framed wedding photograph of Daniel and Melissa that used to sit near the refrigerator was gone now. So was the firefighter commendation plaque he once kept above the coffee station. In fact, the only evidence my son had ever lived there was a single school portrait of the children where Lily's smile looked painfully like his. I stood at the sink staring at the bare countertops when I noticed the garage door slightly open down the hallway. A soft yellow light spilled through the crack. I do not know why I walked toward it. Maybe mothers feel things before they understand them. The garage smelled like dust, cardboard, and fresh paint. Melissa had stacked dozens of storage bins against the far wall with neat white labels written in black marker. Winter decorations, camping gear, old kitchen items. Then I saw one marked simply, Daniel. My chest tightened instantly. I walked closer and slowly lifted the lid. Inside were pieces of my son's life folded together like forgotten laundry. His brown leather jacket, his old softball cap from high school, a pair of worn work gloves from the fire station. Underneath them sat framed photographs wrapped carefully in newspaper. My hands began trembling before I even realized it. Melissa had not donated his things. She had boxed him up. I heard footsteps behind me then. Calm, slow, controlled. I was wondering when you would eventually snoop in here, Melissa said. From the doorway. I turned toward her holding Daniel's jacket against my chest while she leaned casually against the frame with her arms crossed. Why are his things hidden out here? I asked. Her expression never changed. Because some of us are trying to move forward. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I stood there inside that cold garage clutching my son's jacket while Melissa watched me with the calm expression people use when they believe they are being perfectly reasonable. That was the part that hurt the most. She did not think she was cruel. She thought she was practical. Move forward. I repeated quietly. By pretending Daniel never existed? Melissa sighed and stepped farther into the garage. The light overhead cast sharp shadows across her face, making her look older than 38 for the first time since I had known her. That is not what I am doing, she said. But the children cannot stay trapped in grief forever. I looked down at the storage bin again. Folded beneath the jacket was Daniel's old flannel blanket from college, the red one with cigarette burns near the edge from a camping trip he once took in Montana with his friends. I remembered washing that blanket every Thanksgiving when he came home from school because he always claimed laundromats smelled strange. My fingers tightened around the fabric before I answered her. Keeping his memory alive is not trapping anyone. Melissa crossed her arms. You think talking about him constantly helps, but it does not. Lily cries after your visits. Ethan asks questions every night before bed. They should be focusing on school and soccer and normal things. Their father is not a normal thing, I whispered. Her jaw tightened immediately. See? That is exactly what I mean. Everything becomes about loss with you. The words settled heavily between us. Outside, I could hear distant laughter from the backyard, and the crackling sound of marshmallows burning over the fire pit. Life continuing while my son sat boxed inside plastic containers 10 feet away from lawn fertilizer and old Christmas decorations. Melissa walked over and gently lowered the lid halfway closed. I am trying to protect this family, she said. From what? I asked. From remembering him? She looked exhausted suddenly. Not sad. Exhausted. Like grief had become an inconvenience she could no longer tolerate. From living in the past, she answered. Then her voice softened just enough to almost sound kind. Evelyn, Daniel is gone. You are still acting like you lost him yesterday. I stared at her for several seconds before speaking. Because I did. Something flickered across her face then. Irritation. Maybe guilt. Maybe both. But it vanished quickly. I cannot keep doing this with you, she said. Every family event turns heavy the second his name comes up. She opened the garage door wider and gestured toward the backyard where everyone sat laughing beneath warm patio lights. Do you know how hard I have worked to make things feel normal again? I followed her gaze toward the house that once belonged to my son as much as it belonged to her. Then I looked back at the storage bins stacked neatly against the wall like archived paperwork. And for the first time a terrible thought entered my mind. Melissa was not trying to heal from losing Daniel. She was trying to erase him. I barely slept that night. I kept seeing those storage bins every time I closed my eyes. Daniel reduced to labels and plastic containers in a garage beside extension cords and old patio cushions. Around 3 in the morning, I got up and made chamomile tea even though I hated the taste. The house felt too quiet without grief inside it. People never talk about that part. They think mourning is loud crying and dramatic breakdowns. But most grief happens in silence. It lives in empty kitchens and untouched voicemail messages in grocery stores where you still reach automatically for your son's favorite cereal before remembering he is gone. The next afternoon, I drove back to Melissa's house while she was at work. I told myself I only wanted to bring Lily the sweater she forgot at my place, but deep down I knew that was not true. Something inside me needed to see that garage again. The children were still at school, so the house sat perfectly still beneath the pale spring sunlight. Melissa had given me the garage keypad years earlier for emergencies. My fingers hesitated over the numbers before I finally pressed them. The garage door lifted slowly with a low mechanical hum. The smell hit me immediately again. Dust, motor oil, cardboard, forgotten things. I walked straight toward the storage bins labeled with Daniel's name and carefully opened the largest one. This time I dug deeper beneath the clothes and photographs. There were old birthday cards from the children, his firefighter certification papers, a cracked coffee mug that said "World's Okayest, Dad." I smiled despite myself because Daniel loved stupid jokes like that. Then, near the bottom of the bin, my hand brushed against something hard and rectangular. It was an old digital voice recorder. Small, black, scratched along the edges. My breath caught instantly because I recognized it. Daniel used to carry it during long overnight shifts at the station. Sometimes he recorded reminders or random thoughts while driving between emergency calls. My hand started trembling as I turned it over. The battery light still blinked faintly when I pressed the power button. There were dozens of old recordings dated years back. Grocery reminders. Shift notes. One recording labeled simply "Mom." I stopped breathing for a second. The timestamp showed it had been recorded only 6 days before Daniel died. Slowly, I sat down on the cold concrete floor beside the storage bins and pressed play. Static crackled softly through the tiny speaker at first. Then I heard my son's voice. Warm, tired, familiar enough to split my heart open all over again. "Hey Mom," he said quietly. "You are probably never supposed to hear this unless something happens to me." I pressed my hand against my mouth immediately. Outside, somewhere far down the street, a lawnmower hummed in the distance while sunlight stretched across the garage floor. But inside that moment, the entire world stopped moving. I listened to that recording 3 times sitting on the garage floor before I could even breathe normally again. Daniel sounded exhausted in it, like he had just finished another overnight shift at the station. But beneath the tiredness was something else too. Worry. "I know you hate when I talk like this," he said softly through the tiny speaker, followed by a nervous laugh I had heard since he was 16 years old. "But being a firefighter means thinking about things other people avoid." I pressed the recorder closer to my ear as tears blurred my vision. "If anything ever happens to me, promise me Mom will not end up alone," he continued. "She acts strong, but she feels everything deeper than most people." My entire chest tightened at those words. Because he was right. He had always known me better than anyone else in the world. Outside the garage, I heard a dog barking somewhere across the neighborhood and the distant slam of a car door. But inside that little recording, my son was alive again for 2 minutes and 19 seconds. "Melissa likes to keep moving when things get hard," he said carefully. "That is how she survives. But Mom remembers things. She holds on to people. That is her way too." I closed my eyes then because suddenly I understood something painful. Daniel had known. Maybe not everything. Maybe not this exact future. But he had known there would come a day when grief would divide the people he loved instead of bringing them together. The recording crackled softly before his voice returned one last time. "Just do not let her feel forgotten, okay?" Then it ended. Silence filled the garage so completely it almost rang in my ears. I sat there holding the recorder against my chest while tears slipped quietly down my face. Not dramatic sobbing. Just the kind of crying that comes from finally hearing the one thing your broken heart needed most. Proof that your child remembered you too. After a while, I carefully wiped my face and began placing items back inside the storage bin exactly where I found them. That was when I noticed another object tucked beneath a folded station sweatshirt. A small white envelope with my name written across the front in Daniel's handwriting. "Mom." Just 4 letters, but seeing them nearly brought me to my knees again. My fingers shook as I picked it up. The envelope had already been opened. I stared at the torn edge for several seconds before realization settled heavily inside me. Melissa had seen it. She had read whatever was inside and still buried it in a garage bin beneath old clothes and forgotten belongings. Slowly, I pulled the letter from the envelope. The paper was creased and slightly yellowed near the folds. I recognized Daniel's handwriting instantly, large uneven letters slanting slightly to the right like they always had since elementary school. But before I could read more than the first line, I heard the sound of tires crunching across the driveway outside. Melissa was home early. I shoved the letter back into the envelope so quickly I nearly tore the paper. My heart pounded hard enough to make my hands shake while the garage door continued rising behind me. Melissa stepped out of her SUV carrying 2 grocery bags and froze the second she saw me sitting on the floor beside the storage bins. For one brief moment, real panic crossed her face. Not annoyance. Not irritation. Fear. Then it disappeared beneath that polished calm she wore like armor. "What are you doing here?" she asked sharply. I stood up too fast, clutching the envelope and voice recorder against my chest. "I could ask you the same thing," I replied before I could stop myself. Her eyes immediately dropped to the items in my hands. I watched her expression tighten. "You had no right to go through those boxes," she said. "No right." I stared at her in disbelief. "Those boxes contain my son's entire life." Melissa set the grocery bags down carefully on the workbench beside the lawn tools. Even then, everything she did looked controlled. Deliberate. "Daniel was my husband," she said quietly. "Which means those things belong to me." I looked down at the envelope again. Then why was this hidden at the bottom of a storage bin after it had already been opened? Her face changed instantly. Just slightly. But enough. Silence spread between us like smoke. I finally understood then that she knew exactly which letter I had found. Melissa folded her arms tightly across her chest. "You should not read that. He wrote it to me. He wrote it years ago," she snapped. "Before everything changed." I felt something inside me harden at those words. Death does not erase people. "Melissa." She looked exhausted again. But this time there was frustration underneath it. "You think I wanted any of this?" she asked suddenly. "Do you have any idea what it was like trying to keep those children functioning after Daniel died, while you spent every holiday crying into old photo albums?" The cruelty of the words hit me so fast I could barely breathe. "I was grieving my child. And I was trying to save my family," she shot back. We stood there staring at each other across that cold garage filled with the remains of a man we had both loved differently. Then her eyes moved once more toward the voice recorder in my hand. "Did you listen to it?" she asked quietly. I did not answer immediately. I wanted to. I wanted to tell her every single word Daniel had spoken. But something stopped me. Maybe instinct. Maybe the sudden realization that my son's final thoughts had been hidden from me for 3 years. "Yes," I said finally. Melissa closed her eyes briefly before turning away toward the workbench. "I knew this day would happen eventually," she whispered. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. "That recording is exactly why I kept those boxes hidden." I stared at her. "What does that mean?" She hesitated for several seconds before speaking again. "Because Daniel knew I would move on someday," she said softly. "And he knew you never would." Her words stayed with me all the way home. Not because they were true, but because somewhere deep inside I realized Melissa believed them completely. She saw my grief as weakness. Something embarrassing. Something outdated. Like an old photograph left hanging too long after the person inside it was gone. That night, I finally opened Daniel's letter at my kitchen table beneath the yellow light over the stove. I made myself a cup of coffee even though it was nearly 10 o'clock because I knew sleep was impossible now anyway. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows while the old clock above my refrigerator ticked loud enough to sound lonely. My hands shook unfolding the paper. "Dear Mom," the letter began in Daniel's uneven handwriting. "If you are reading this, then either I forgot where I hid it or life turned out differently than I hoped." I smiled through tears immediately because that sounded exactly like him. Even serious things could not stop him from trying to make people feel lighter. The letter was only 2 pages long, but every line felt like hearing his voice again. He wrote about the children, about how proud he was of Lily for learning piano, and how Ethan still insisted on wearing mismatched socks. He thanked me for every basketball game, every packed lunch, every night I stayed awake worrying until he got home safely as a teenager. Halfway through the letter, my eyes stopped on one sentence, so suddenly my breathing caught. Mom, if Melissa ever starts trying too hard to move on, please do not take it personally. That is how she survives pain. She runs from it. I read that line 3 times. Then 4. Rain continued sliding down the kitchen windows while the coffee in my mug slowly turned cold beside me. Daniel knew. Maybe he had seen it during arguments they never shared with anyone else. Maybe he understood parts of Melissa that I never could. But the sentence that broke me came near the end. You taught me that remembering people is another way of loving them. Please do not let anybody make you feel ashamed for loving me after I am gone. I lowered the letter then because I could not see through the tears anymore. For 3 years I had started believing maybe I really was grieving wrong. Maybe I was too emotional, too attached, too stuck in the past. Melissa repeated it so often that eventually even silence began sounding like agreement. But Daniel himself had just given me permission to remember him. Permission to keep loving him openly. The next morning, I woke up to 3 missed calls from Melissa. I almost ignored them. But then I noticed the voicemail she left at 7:12 a.m. Her voice sounded tight and controlled, the way people sound when they are trying not to panic. Evelyn, she said carefully, we need to talk before this weekend. I am hosting a Memorial Day barbecue for the neighborhood, and I need you to promise me something before you come. I listened to Melissa's voicemail twice before calling her back. She answered immediately, like she had been standing there staring at her phone waiting for me. Thank you, she said quickly before I could even speak. I just need this weekend to go smoothly. I leaned against my kitchen counter holding the phone while morning sunlight stretched across the floorboards. What exactly are you asking me to promise? There was a pause on the line. Not long. Just long enough to tell me she had rehearsed this conversation in her head already. No emotional scenes, she said carefully. The neighbors are coming. Some parents from Lily's school too. I do not want the children overwhelmed. Emotional scenes. The words settled over me slowly. Like grief was a tantrum. Like mourning your dead son was somehow poor manners at a barbecue. Melissa, I said quietly, it is Memorial Day. Exactly, she replied too quickly. People want something uplifting, not depressing. I closed my eyes then because suddenly I felt tired in a way sleep could never fix. Your husband died serving this community, I whispered. My son spent 15 years running into burning buildings for strangers. Her voice sharpened immediately. And now he is gone, Evelyn. Everybody understands that except you. Silence filled the line between us. I could hear dishes clinking faintly in the background at her house. Life continuing. Always continuing. You know what your real problem is, she said finally. You think loving Daniel more gives you ownership over grief. The sentence hit harder than I expected because part of me knew she believed it. Maybe she had spent years feeling compared to me without ever saying it aloud. Mothers and wives love differently. But loss does not measure itself neatly like recipes or grocery lists. That is not true, I answered softly. Then stop making every gathering about him. After we hung up, I sat alone at my kitchen table for nearly an hour staring at Daniel's letter beside my coffee mug. Outside, a mail truck moved slowly through the neighborhood while sprinklers clicked rhythmically across freshly cut lawns. Ordinary suburban life. The kind Daniel used to joke about becoming after retirement someday. Around noon, Lily called me from Melissa's phone. Grandma Evelyn, she asked quietly, are you still coming Saturday? I smiled despite the heaviness inside me. Of course I am. Her voice dropped lower immediately. Mom says we are supposed to keep things happy this year. I looked down at Daniel's letter again. And what do you want? There was another pause. Then my granddaughter whispered something that nearly broke my heart. I do not want everybody acting like Daddy never happened. After the call ended, I walked slowly into my bedroom closet and reached for the small cedar box I had not opened in nearly a year. Inside were old photographs, birthday cards, and the navy blue tie Daniel wore at his wedding. Beneath them sat the digital voice recorder. I picked it up carefully in both hands while sunlight flickered softly across the bedroom wall. Then for the first time since Daniel died, I stopped feeling ashamed of my grief. And I started feeling angry. Memorial Day arrived warm and painfully beautiful. The kind of perfect suburban afternoon Daniel used to love. Bright blue sky. Fresh-cut grass. American flags hanging from porches all down the neighborhood street. I sat in my car outside Melissa's house for nearly 5 minutes before going in. Families laughed in backyards nearby while children rode bicycles along the sidewalks with little red and blue streamers tied to the handlebars. Everywhere I looked, people celebrated freedom and sacrifice. And all I could think about was my son. Melissa's backyard already buzzed with conversation when I walked through the gate carrying a bowl of potato salad and my purse slung carefully over my shoulder. The digital recorder rested inside it beside Daniel's letter. Melissa spotted me immediately from across the patio. Her smile looked polished and strained at the same time. "Evelyn," she called brightly. "You made it." I nodded calmly. I said I would. Around 30 people filled the backyard. Neighbors, school parents, a few relatives. Country music played softly through outdoor speakers while burgers smoked on the grill. Everything looked normal. That was Melissa's gift. She could make even grief look impolite beside decorative patio lanterns. Lily ran over and hugged me tightly the second she saw me. Ethan followed behind her carrying a paper plate overloaded with chips and watermelon slices. "Grandma Evelyn," he whispered quietly. "Mom said we are not supposed to talk about sad things today." I crouched down carefully beside him. "Remembering your father is not sad," I told him softly. "It is love." Before he could answer, Melissa appeared beside us holding a tray of lemonade glasses. "Okay, sweetheart," she interrupted lightly. "Why do not you help Uncle Greg with the sparklers?" The children wandered off while Melissa turned toward me with that same tight smile. "Please," she whispered under her breath, "do not start anything today." I looked at her for several seconds before answering. "I am not the one hiding him." Her expression hardened instantly, but before she could reply, one of the neighbors tapped a spoon gently against a glass. "Melissa," the woman called cheerfully, "you should say a few words before dinner." Applause scattered politely around the patio. Melissa smoothed her hair and stepped beside the grill with practiced confidence. "Thank you all for coming," she began warmly. "Today is about celebrating family, community, and moving forward together." Moving forward. The phrase landed heavily inside my chest. Then she continued speaking about resilience and new beginnings while guests nodded approvingly around folding tables covered in patriotic decorations. Not once did she say Daniel's name. Not once. I felt Lily slide quietly into the empty chair beside me halfway through Melissa's speech. My granddaughter looked up at me with wide, uncertain eyes. "Grandma," she whispered, "why does everybody act weird when Daddy gets mentioned?" I looked across the backyard toward Melissa standing beneath strings of white patio lights, smiling gracefully at people who barely knew my son existed. Then I slowly reached into my purse and wrapped my fingers around the recorder. I do not remember standing up from my chair. 1 second Lily was beside me asking why everyone acted uncomfortable whenever her father's name came up, and the next I was walking slowly across the patio with the recorder in my hand while Melissa finished thanking everyone for coming. The backyard grew quieter with every step I took. Maybe people sensed something shifting. Maybe grief finally got tired of sitting politely in the corner pretending not to exist. Melissa noticed the recorder immediately. Her smile faltered for half a second before returning again. "Evelyn," she said softly through clenched teeth. "Not now." But for the first time in 3 years, I did not feel embarrassed for loving my son openly. I felt embarrassed for everyone who treated his memory like an inconvenience. I stopped beside the patio table and looked around at the faces staring back at me. Neighbors holding paper plates. Relatives avoiding eye contact. Children sitting cross-legged on lawn chairs beneath tiny American flags fluttering in the warm afternoon wind. "I only want to share something Daniel recorded 6 days before he died," I said quietly. Melissa stepped closer immediately. "Please do not do this," she whispered. But I pressed play anyway. Static crackled softly through the speaker before Daniel's voice filled the backyard. Warm, familiar, human. Every conversation stopped instantly. "If anything ever happens to me," he said, "promise me Mom will not end up alone." I heard someone set down a glass nearby. The entire patio had gone silent except for the recording. Melissa likes to keep moving when things get hard. Daniel continued gently. That is how she survives. But Mom remembers people. She holds on to them. That is love too. I looked toward Melissa then. Her face had gone completely pale. Daniel's voice continued through the speaker while the afternoon sunlight flickered across the stunned faces around us. Please do not let anybody make her feel ashamed for loving me after I am gone. When the recording ended, nobody moved for several long seconds. Even the music from the outdoor speakers seemed suddenly distant and ridiculous. Then Lily started crying quietly beside her chair. Grandma never forgot Daddy, she whispered through tears. Ethan walked slowly toward me and wrapped his small arms around my waist without saying a word. Across the patio, Melissa stood frozen beside the grill with tears gathering. In her eyes for the first time since Daniel's funeral. Not angry tears. Not defensive tears. The kind that come when truth finally breaks through something you spent years trying to bury. I reached into my purse one final time and removed Daniel's letter. My hands no longer trembled as I unfolded it, beneath the warm Memorial Day sunlight. You taught me that remembering people is another way of loving them. I read aloud. Please do not let anybody make you feel ashamed for loving me after I am gone. The backyard remained completely silent after that. No applause. No dramatic speeches. Just silence heavy enough for everyone to finally feel what had been missing from that house for 3 long years. Early the next morning, I returned to Daniel's grave carrying fresh white carnations. The cemetery was quiet except for birds singing somewhere high in the trees. I knelt beside the headstone and gently placed the flowers down before resting my hand against the cool marble. They almost made me believe grief was something ugly, I whispered. Then I smiled softly through tears as sunlight warmed my face. But love does not become embarrassing just because somebody is gone.